I'm Mary Fitzgerald, the CEO of Eluna. Welcome to the latest installment of Community Conversations, Grief Through the Lens of Latino Culture. Thank you for making the time to join us today, and thank you to our sponsor and partner, M&T Bank, who makes this panel possible. On November 4th, Eluna will be commemorating 20 years of serving children and families impacted by grief or addiction. Since 2000, we have served 42,000 youth through Camp Erin and Camp Mariposa and over 230,000 visitors to our resource center. Alongside our incredible partners and thought leaders in over 50 communities across the US and Canada, we are dedicated to creating a deeper understanding of grief and the disease of addiction, eradicating this stigma, and making sure we can create a more inclusive and equitable support network. So we are incredibly excited about today's panel. Thank you to all of our panelists for your willingness to share your knowledge with us. And now it is my sincere pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, the lovely and talented Joy Soto, Community Voices and Engagement Fellow for WHYY here in Philadelphia. Thank you.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome. The events of 2020 magnified the need to prioritize awareness of the diversity of the American experience, as well as build understanding, deepen empathy, and increase respect for the differences. Eluna's Grief Through the Lens series explores the tradition and values that inform children's grief responses. Our intention is that the Grief Through the Lens will build a richer foundation of understanding and broaden our definitions of what grief looks like. We believe this will build equity and expand our diverse population. In our first of the series, today's conversation explores the Hispanic and Latino culture's unique response to death and grief. We hope this virtual event we believe this will build equity and expand our diverse population. In our first of the series, today's conversation explores the Hispanic and Latino's unique response to death and grief. We hope for this virtual event to truly inspire dialogue and encourage you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, which we will answer towards the end of today's program. Lastly, keep an eye out on the chat. We will also be sharing relevant resources throughout the conversation. With that, I'd like to thank and introduce the panelists, and I will invite them to tell you more about the communities that they serve. First, we have Dr. Rochelle Clarke, Director of Organizational Integration and Patient Experience at Catholic Hospice. Cindy Waddle, Senior Counselor at Children's Bereavement Center, Rio Grande Valley. And Christina Chipriano, Director of Equity and Community Outreach at the Dougy Center. Thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your history working with the Spanish-speaking community and grief? How did you come into this role? And please tell us where you are and the communities that you work with. Rochelle, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you, Joy. It's so nice to be here with all of you guys. I work for Catholic Hospice, and so working in grief is a part of the job that we do. However, working with children's grief comes from our bereavement camp that is run through the Eluna Foundation, and I've been working with our children's bereavement camp for a little bit over 7 years now. South Florida is where I am, and so we are a majority-minority community, especially here in Miami. 70% of our residents are Spanish-speaking, majority of which are from Cuba.
Thank you so much. Cindy, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. So I've been working as a counselor in the nonprofit sector for about 9 years. I have experience working with refugee minors traveling to the United States from the Northern Triangle of Central America. There we worked with a lot of youth who've experienced grief and loss, not only through death loss, but also multiple losses through their migration to the United States. That was an easy and smooth transition to my work currently as a senior counselor at the Children's Bereavement Center, Rio Grande Valley, and we're located in deep South Texas. We border the Mexican state of Tamaulipas, and so our community is also predominantly Hispanic, and so we serve a lot of the Latino and Hispanic population in our area.
Thank you. And Christina.
Thanks, Joy. So I am the Director of Equity and Community Outreach at the Dougy Center, which is based in Portland, Oregon, and I oversee their Esperanza program, which is specifically geared towards providing a space for the Spanish-speaking community of the greater Portland area. Prior to my work at the Dougy Center, I worked for a children's bereavement center in Houston for the past about 6.5 years, where I oversaw their Spanish language program and specifically working with the Latino community of Houston, which is where I reside in. And so everything just translated really easily into one another, but so much of my work has been focused on making grief services accessible to the Latino community, specifically the Spanish-speaking community.
Great. Thank you again for joining us today for this amazing conversation. So Christina, I'd like to start with you. So we recognize that there's a broad range of religious and family traditions within the Hispanic and Latino community. It is not a monolith culture. Do you think that there are some common misconceptions or generalizations about the culture? And can you share if and how those impact grieving children?
Absolutely. So I think you hit the nail on the head right there. Like, Latinos are not a monolithic culture, right? We represent over 33 countries of Latin America. And there are many misconceptions that it's a homogenous group in that sense. And so just as we would with anyone that's sitting in front of us, we need to meet people with cultural humility and allow them to be the experts of their own story. I would not consider myself an expert when it comes to all things Latinos, even though I identify as a Latina myself. I recognize that the person sitting in front of me could prescribe to the cultural values in different ways. And so one of the big things that we need to do as providers is to truly meet people with curiosity and to empower them to tell us their story, how they're responding to their grief experience.
Thank you so much. So let's talk a little bit about as you can tell, I'm not native Spanish speaker, familismo, and how that might impact a family's response to a death in the family. So let's talk about exactly what it is. Cindy, could you go into a little bit about that?
Sure, thank you. In the Hispanic culture, immediate relationships and extended relationships with family members are very important, and that's part of familismo. It's family members looking out for each other for emotional support during difficult times, and seeking that support within their own family unit before reaching out to professional caretakers that can take on this role for families. And it involves a commitment that family has to one another, and seeking that support with one another. And so for many families, sometimes this can be a barrier to seeking mental health services or seeking support after the loss of a loved one, because it's often that culture is that they are there to support one another, and often what happens in the family stays in the family. And so for healthcare providers, sometimes it's not just working with one parent or one child, but it's involving the entire family system to be a part of this support for the children and for the family as a whole.
And Rochelle, can you talk about how this shows up in the community that you serve?
So it's funny, I first had to Google what familismo was, and then I was talking to some other people, and I'm like, we're not familiar with that terminology. However, the concept of family, the concept of extended family, the concept of being a community is something that resonates with me and also with the people who I work with. So what we try to do is, especially working in like a hospice setting, when we identify that there are multiple generations living in a home, we anticipate how things are going to go by really trying to become a part of that family's community. How can we serve you better? You're doing such a great job looking after everybody else. Can we be there to support you? And so what we notice is when we're able to really become a part of that family unit, once the person has transitioned and they're now getting grief support, especially through camp for the younger children, we're able to really tackle all different factors of grief, but it first comes with being a part of the community and being recognized as someone who's there to support the family as a whole.
And Christina, can you tell us a little bit about how it shows up in the community that you serve?
Absolutely. So when there's a component of family in I will consider it the Western society framework, right? Where we think of it as being a nuclear family. And you look at family within the many Latino cultures, your family is so much broader than who lives in your home. In many homes are multi-generational homes. You have uncles and aunts, tios and tias who you don't have zero idea how they're related to you, but they're part of the family and they are there for weekend celebration. I mean, they are there and they are present. And so when we look at our traditional grief support centers, right, many have this, the guidelines around deaths being directly related to a caregiver or a sibling in the family. And for much of the work that I've done, we've had to expand what that means in terms of who's coming into the program. So if it's been the death of an aunt or an uncle or a cousin, knowing that it's not just impacting those that were living in that same home, but also the entire family itself. So really taking a step back to understand the concept of familismo, to understand this concept of family, and being a little bit more lenient in the guidelines of who's coming into, who's receiving our services.
Thank you so much. For our next question, can you talk about how gender roles within the culture influences a child's grief in response to the death of a parent? For example, is there an expectation for children to adopt a specific role in their family after a loss? If so, are there different expectations for girls versus boys? Rochelle, can you talk a bit about the different roles?
So just through my lens of observing children who come to camp, especially if they're siblings at the camp, if the brother, if a male, is the oldest, there is that need to take care of the younger siblings to make sure everything is okay. And on the other spectrum, when we're looking at if it's a girl, and she's the oldest, we've noticed that not only is she taking care of her siblings, but she's also taking care of people within her group for camp. So because we're aware that things like that typically happen, we really try to make sure that we, pull that camper aside and we'll say, listen, this is for you too. While we see how much love you want to give to everyone and how you want to make sure everybody else is okay, it's really important for you just to focus on these activities as well. And so we have noticed that at camp, if there's an older sibling, if it's the boy, like I said, he's making sure everybody's okay and taken care of. And if it's the girl, she's catering to not only her siblings, but to everyone in her peer group.
Thank you. Christina, would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, so I would add too, there's at times this expectation of the oldest stepping into whatever if there's been a parental death, whatever that role was. So it really, I've seen it as young as maybe 8 or so, where someone has said to, let's say there's been a death of a father, someone has said to the oldest son, you are now the man of the house. It is now your responsibility to take care and protect. And so there's this, whether it's meant to be supportive, but it adds quite a bit of pressure to children, right? And we take away part of their grief experience because they're now stepping into really adult roles. And like Rochelle mentioned, it's really, and it's present. And whether or not someone says it, or the children take on these roles themselves of trying to be, if it's males, it's trying to be a protector and a provider of the family. If it's a female or a girl, it's more so this nurturing, caring. I once had also an 8-year-old whose father worked in law enforcement, and he was getting ready to leave the house, and she was like, do you have your vest? Do you have what you need? Like, she was going through all his equipment. He's like, whoa, like, you've never done this before. And she's like, yeah, but I need to make sure that you're okay and that you're safe. And so part of that, also stepping into that caring maternal role that happens. And so I think that there are pieces there that whether it's present very blatantly because somebody has said it is now your responsibility, or it's more of a subconscious thing that happens culturally, there is this space where kids step into those roles.
Thank you. Cindy, I want to direct this part toward you. What are some ways that moms and dads express their grief, and are children included in their process? What should we know about working with Hispanic parents?
Thank you, Joy. What I've seen in my community is that often caregivers grieve very privately as a means of protecting or sheltering not just their children, but also other members of the family. I just recently spoke to a caregiver who was sharing, I feel so alone in my grief, but I don't want to burden anyone else because I know my mother is grieving and she's so lost in her grief, and I don't want my child to feel as if I'm not capable of caring for him or her because they're worried about me and my grief. And so that's something that we see quite often in our caregivers, is to that ability to recognize the grief that everybody else is carrying and trying to shelter, protect them from that. And so sometimes that can be a challenge because many times we're communicating as caregivers to the child that it's okay to talk about our feelings or express our feelings, but sometimes they're not seeing the caregivers model that because they're trying to be strong for one another. And on the reverse, I've seen that with children as well, where they'll say, you know what, mom's just having a really good day and I don't want to burden her with my sadness. And so I just keep it to myself. And that goes back to that familismo where we're trying to protect and support one another. And often we put others before ourselves is what we see a lot in the Latino community. But we also recognize that a lot of the caregivers are willing to seek additional support or services in their community, such as bereavement support, if they feel that it will benefit others in the home, if it will benefit the child. And so going back to not just working with the individual child or the caregiver, but it's providing that support to that entire support system, because the roles of moms and dads are not always mothers and fathers, but sometimes they're grandmothers or grandfathers who also play a really big role in that nurturing piece of caring for the children and the family. And so quite complicated relationships, but it's also really beautiful to see how everyone's caring for one another. And part of our role is just opening up those lines of communication and allowing them to do it together as a family.
Thank you so much. So I want to dive into language. So obviously working with the Hispanic and Latino community, that's definitely something huge. So we recognize that the Spanish language is nuanced and has many dialects. How do language differences impact support? Christina, could you like to answer that first?
Yeah, I'll start by sharing just my own personal story with it. So Spanish is my first language, and I consider myself much more fluent in that than I do English. And I was working with a family that, and my family's from El Salvador. So I was working, I happened to be doing an orientation for a family who was from the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic specifically. And so we're sitting together and we're speaking Spanish, and this father keeps telling me what I'm understanding to be is like, look at her, she just keeps yelling, and she's just yelling all the time. And I'm sitting there and I was like, I don't think that's what's happening right now. And so I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, look at it. And his wife was sitting there and mom's just silent. And I was like, what do you, we spent 5 minutes of me sitting there being like, I don't hear it. He's like, what do you mean you don't hear it? She's yelling. And I was like, okay. What does that word mean? What does that mean for you? And then he's like, like yelling. And he kept doing like tears. And I was like, oh, you mean crying? And then he looked at me and said, no one's raising their voice. And I was like, we are not speaking the same language. And it was a really a moment for me to recognize that, like, it as much as I thought we were speaking the same language, and there's so many variations within language itself that really taking that moment, as I mentioned earlier, meeting folks with curiosity and just saying, like, what does that mean for you? And can you describe that for me? Because small words can make such a huge difference and when you're talking to people. And I think there too, what we see, right, is that folks prescribe to their language depending on just who they are. We have different languages of our hearts and the way that we are able to express our emotions. For some folks, that's Spanish. For others, there's English, and it can be it can look very different within a family. So being able to ask parents and children, like, what language do you prefer to talk about your emotions in, and to talk about this person in, because you'd be surprised, even though they might be coming in through your Spanish language resources, most of the kids are like, nah, I need English, right? Or they're like, oh no, I can do either. So just really not being afraid to ask that question, like, which language do you prefer to speak in? And when you don't know, simply just ask, what does that mean?
Thank you so much. Cindy, can you talk about, in your experiences, the language differences and how they impact grief support?
Sure. So living in a border community, we do have a lot of bilingual community members, and we know that there are emotional ties to our first language. What we see in our community specifically is a lot of times the adult caregivers have a preference for Spanish, whether that's their only language or their primary or first language. We do communicate a lot with our caregivers in Spanish. Our team, we're fortunate to have a bilingual team here at our center. But we also see that school-age children often prefer English as their language of preference. And so it's being able to be flexible and adapt. It's not uncommon for me to start a session in English and finish it in Spanish, or even just transition into Spanish when maybe we don't have the right words to express our feelings. Or I often will see kiddos or even caregivers who will speak in English, and they'll kind of have a moment of pause, and I could tell they're looking for the right words. And often just giving them permission to say, it's okay if you prefer to speak it in Spanish. And sometimes they'll use idioms or other forms of communication that sometimes there is no translation to English. And so it's being able to really allow them and give them permission to access the words that best communicate their inner experience. And part of that for our center is having resources, bilingual resources for our community, such as like our feeling charts are in English and Spanish, and giving them the choice to be able to find the best way to communicate their feelings.
Thank you. And Rochelle, can you talk about your experiences with language and dialect issues?
Well, they mirror a lot of what Christina and Cindy are saying, specifically as it relates to the adults preferring to speak Spanish and the younger children preferring to speak English. And so oftentimes there can be some frustration, especially if you're going through and doing grief therapy, with that language barrier. So the parents want the child to be able to communicate, in Spanish, and the child is adamant that they're not going to speak Spanish, they're going to speak English. And so oftentimes what we'll do is we'll create some sort of an activity, like an art activity. And so without using words per se, let's see how we can communicate our emotions, and it be in a way that's not one that is causing any kind of discord. It's one that's really having them to look outside of the use of language and perhaps coming together with the colors that they're using, with the description of what those colors mean. And so helping them just to expand communication.
Thank you. Let's explore some traditions around funeral and burial practices and how this can complicate grieving for children and their families. Christina, how, where, and when you are buried impacts grief. Asking families about how, where, and how you are buried impacts grief. Can you go a little bit into detail about that with the communities that you're working with?
Yes. So much of my work has been with folks who either are first generation or second generation into the States. And so there is, for many, when there's been a death in the home country, there at times are barriers that prevent the family or those who are grieving and we're working with here in the States to be able to go back home, whether it's documentation, and this is pre-COVID, right, when travel was a thing, or things happen very quickly, and so there's just no way to get back to the home country. And so for many, having to have the conversation of like, were you able to attend the funeral? Like, you can't make an assumption that they were, because there's a very high chance that they didn't, and they either had to video in, or somebody sent pictures, or they just said, hey, by the way, this happened, and then this is where they're buried. Or there is someone dies in the States and their preference has been to be buried in their home country and the family here can't go back with them. So there's just an additional layer or additional just factor that one needs to be aware of when working. I would say specifically with first generation and second generation Latinos, of just asking, like, were you able to attend the services? Because it's not always the case that they're able to, and it really does add a layer, as many of us have seen in the lens of COVID, right? The inability to say goodbye and to participate within that ritual can really prolong just the beginning of the grief journey of just knowing that that person is no longer here. And so I've seen it with the communities that I've worked, just this desire to go back, this desire to know what does it look like, and where are they, and is it being taken care of, or I'm sending money back so that they can put flowers, and I just hope that that's the case. It's this desire to connect. So a lot of the work that I have done with the families here is really focused on how do you memorialize here, right? Like how do you find a space here that you can connect to your person, whether it's not back to that physical grave site.
Wow, thank you. Rochelle, can you talk about your experiences with children and families in the community that you serve?
Particularly around funeral, it's going to be different, right? So we talked a little bit about, even though Spanish might be your first language, the cultures that you're in, because of the countries that you're from, are very different. And so I think religion has a lot to do with it as well. So for some people who are Spanish speaking, their religion influences how funerals are. And is there mourning, and what does the mourning process look like? And so much like what Christina was saying, here in South Florida with the Cuban population, oftentimes when someone passes away, we're dealing with compounding grief factors. It may be that families can't come because of restrictions. There also may be, the fact that people want to go back and be buried in their home country, and because of those very restrictions, they're unable to do that. And so when the loss occurs, the loss is bringing about not only the reality of someone's physical death, but their inability to go back to their home country and the reasons that might have brought them here. And so there are so many complex factors to consider when working with grief here in South Florida.
Thank you. And Cindy, any experiences that you have, maybe a story from your community?
Yes, absolutely, Joy. And I just want to echo what Rochelle and Christina were saying, that it's a lot of what we see in our community here is the challenges of cross-culturally grieving and mourning. In my community, we're predominantly Mexican American, and so I can speak a little bit about the culture as I identify as Mexican American, is the culture of embracing death as part of life. And we see a lot in our community that there are long periods of mourning and elaborate funerals that take place in order to say goodbye to a loved one. And sometimes that can be a challenge when there isn't access to a burial site. Conversely, when we do have families here in the States where their loved ones are buried in their own community, one thing that I've witnessed in working with the families here is that there is that continued connection with the deceased. And so as opposed to detaching from the deceased, a lot of times those relationships continue with their loved one, especially when it comes to visiting gravesites. I've had numerous families who will make daily trips to the cemetery. I can think of an individual that we were working with who would, at odd hours of the day, whether it was midnight or 2 a.m., when they felt that separation from their loved one, to be able to go out to the gravesite in the middle of the night just to feel that continued connection. And there's a lot of different rituals that go with that. Like Rochelle said, there's a big spiritual component that comes with mourning the loved one, whether that's having novenarios, which are 9 consecutive days of prayer that the family believes helps the individual soul go to eternal rest. We see in our community also families who do anniversaries of the death, where they hold special masses, and families join and gather at the graveside to remember and recall the memory of their loved one. And so I think it's definitely different for every culture. As I worked with the immigrants from Central America, their practices and their beliefs were very different. And so just being able to recognize that not only from country to country and culture to culture, but also within the family units, that everybody will observe and practice those burial rituals very differently. And it's okay to ask questions and learn more about how they practice that as a family.
Wow, thank you. So I'd like to switch gears a little bit, and because we're obviously virtual, start a Q&A session and engage our audience. So our first question is, as an Afro-Latinx therapist from Belize, I often notice a struggle with my Caribbean and Latinx clients, the mixing of spiritual support during grief. How would you recommend encouraging our communities to accept or see the benefit of both professional mental health support and spiritual support as a cohesive method to address grief and loss? Would anyone like to kick that off?
Well, I can say, working for a Catholic organization, we believe that we meet anyone wherever they are in their spiritual journey. So they don't have to be Catholic. We meet them wherever they are. And as we deliver that sort of psychotherapy that goes along with talking about grief and loss, and the first thing we ask is, what does this mean to you? It's so important, like what Cindy and Christina said, is to meet someone where they are. How has your spirituality been helpful? How has it been impactful? How does it inform you throughout the grief process? And then really focus on whatever those strengths are within the therapeutic dialogue, so that they can rely on those strengths. Because through grief and loss, you really want to find, what are those coping mechanisms that they're using? And if their spirituality is helpful to them, then we want them to do more of that. And so just allowing that space. While I'm not an expert to talk to you about theology or spirituality, I can understand from your lens how it might be helpful and supportive to you.
Thank you.
I'll jump in now as someone who works for a secular nonprofit, and where spirituality, when it comes up in group, it does. It's impossible for it not to, and especially when we're talking about grief, it's just making sure that we set the tone in the group, that everybody's perspective and wherever someone's coming from is welcomed, right? And that we're not imposing those beliefs on others, that there isn't any advice giving that's happening unless somebody specifically says, what can I do for this, or like specifically ask for it. But really being aware and mindful that with death, people either find support and reach into their spirituality or distance themselves from it, and all of that is welcomed in that sense. And so quite a bit of this, to the person who's asking, I can hear or in the question just a little bit about that. I think conflict that happens sometimes with one of the cultural values that we find in the Latino community of fatalismo or fatalism, right? Like the acceptance that this was the plan, this was the way that things were supposed to go. And so to go outside of the plan, whatever plan that was, right? And to seek support can just contradict the not being okay and not accepting the reality of what's happened. And so it's really providing psychoeducation in some regards, of just being able to tell folks, being able to be in the space where others who get what it is and get what this experience is can be beneficial. And so there's that piece too, of just being open to wherever folks are coming from in terms of their spirituality, and also providing a little bit of psychoed of what, at least in the support group environment, how that can be beneficial to the grief experience.
And I'd like to I'd like to chime in. I definitely agree with Rochelle and Christina. It's really just meeting the families where they're at and holding a safe space for everybody and recognizing that not everyone may have the same spiritual beliefs or lean on their spirituality in the same way as they go through their grief. From our experience here at the Children's Bereavement Center, we also try to have those community resources and network with other spiritual entities in our community that we can also connect families to should they want to explore more of the spiritual aspect of their loss. To be able to connect them with religious leaders in our community can also be a good resource for you as well.
Thank you so much. I'd like to get at least one more question in. So are there cultural barriers that prevent Hispanic and Latino children from having access to mental health? A little bit off the last question, mental health support. How do we overcome those barriers? Christina, could you talk a little bit about maybe some stigmas?
Absolutely. I think just touching upon the last piece that I talked a little bit about, right? The fatalism piece of just accepting that this was supposed to be to push against the grain, that we're going against the bigger plan or the divine or whatever that was, can produce quite a bit of anxiety for families of just feeling like we're not okay with what's happened in terms of this was meant to be, is one of the bigger pieces. But the stigma that mental health services is something that and I'm quoting Es cosa de locos, right? It's for crazy people, and really just unfortunately the access to mental health services in Latin America isn't as prominent as it is in the States. And so just the idea that something could be accessible free of charge, it can be just both unfathomable, but also just a challenge to get folks to connect to. So one of the ways in which, I mean, you're pushing against the grain of things that are present consciously and subconsciously within the cultures, is truly what is your presence of in the community, right? And how are you building community partnerships? Because it can be tough to walk into a community and be like, hey, check it out, we have free services, and no one knows what it is that you're doing, and you're there to talk about the one thing that we don't talk about outside of our homes, right? We don't talk about death and our feelings outside of our family, going back to familismo, and yet you want us to come into this space that wasn't built for us and talk about it. So it's so much of this is also really being intentional with the community buy-in that one is building in our partnerships with community organizations that are doing the work, and being present in the community to provide some of that psychoeducation, but also just presence of saying like, we're here and this space exists to be able to support this. And then I'll just add quickly, it's also really, when working with families, as I think Cindy mentioned earlier, everybody's trying to help each other, right? So if you're trying to reach kids, right? And so parents will say, yeah, we'll do this for our kids. I've often worked with like dual parent families where the husband saying, well, I'm here for my wife says, I'm here for my kids say, I'm here for my parents. So everybody's trying to support each other. So as long as you can make it into one of those, whoever you're trying to help in that regard, usually you can get the entire family's buy-in because everybody's trying to support each other.
Thank you. Rochelle, any thoughts on some kind of cultural barriers within mental health support?
I think just the name mental health, like Christina said, is like a stigma. People automatically assume sometimes that someone is either crazy or in some cultures, someone may be possessed of some sort. And so that's why they're exhibiting a certain type of behavior. And so we don't say mental health. We talk about issues that are happening, but we don't use the word mental health. And so what I think has been really great is that we talked a lot about home countries, right? And so getting the support and understanding how it can be helpful, and then getting the resources and utilizing it and seeing the usefulness and helpfulness of it. We've seen how people have gone to their home country or shared collateral about grief support or mental health issues without you languaging it that way back in their communities, and how helpful it's been. So I think that whatever community you're in, you want to make sure that the words that we're using to language certain things are going to come across in a way that's going to be helpful. And so in my experience, saying mental illness or mental health has not been helpful, but addressing it has been quite successful.
Great, that's very interesting. And Cindy, any final thoughts, just overall about stigmas, mental health, but also to close out this conversation?
Sure. Well, just talking about the stigmas and barriers, piggyback on what Rochelle said, is I definitely agree in terms of the language that is used. Is, you know, this is a place for support. We really lean on that idea of building community, and so for our families, this is not a place that you come to because there's a problem, but rather you're building a community of support. And so the counselors are part of that support system, and the families that you meet here are part of that support system. And we often see it does become part of that extended family where we have you know, family members and participants at group that come, and we call in Spanish saludo de beso, where we, you know, hug and kiss and greet each other. And it just becomes part of that community for the family. And so it's just really positioning it in a way of saying this isn't, you're not here because something is wrong with you or your child or your family, but this is a place where you can meet others who can relate to you and your experience and your family's experience. And just really having the resources, if you're working with a bilingual population, to have your forms in Spanish and to have someone that can maybe answer the phone in Spanish, because often we'll get calls from school counselors or pediatricians who will simply just call and say, I want to refer someone, but I want to make sure before I give them your number that there's somebody that will speak to them in Spanish when they make that call. And so simply just that fear of I'm going to call and no one's going to be able to help me can be a barrier to seeking that support. And so I'm trying to find the resources within your community so that families feel comfortable to reach out. You know, having a Spanish section in your website or on your social media page can be really helpful as well.
Thank you so much. I want to just thank all our panelists for taking the time out of your day. I know we're all over the nation today. I hope those that join the conversation, whether you're professional mental health, I hope there's maybe some parents or just community members that can use the resources in the conversation. Definitely check out the resources that were in the chat. And I know this will be recorded. I'm sure it will be announced where this will be able to be shared. And thank you again for participating and having me as well. I'm going to kick it off to Molly, I believe, for closing remarks.
So much, Joy. I'm really grateful to Rochelle, Cindy, and Christina for the time and the insights that you provided for us. And thank you again, Joy, for hosting. I also want to thank Alexa Jarvis for helping me launch this initiative, and for Aida Wells from Seattle Children's for her insights as well. This conversation, as mentioned before, is part of a larger series called Grief Through the Lens, where we explore the grief responses in different cultures in the hopes of providing better support for all grieving children. So please stay tuned for more installments of this series. In the meantime, a video of this conversation will be posted on the Resource Center. And as Megan explained in the chat, you can look forward to a link in that in a future email. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Resource Center because we have two different aspects to the Resource Center. We're an online library that explores everything from mindfulness to suicide prevention, and just if you want to know about how to talk to kids about grief or substance use disorder. Many of the resources that we shared in the chat are from the library. We also provide personalized support, so please reach out to me for more direct referrals to programs and resources when you come across a family or child in your community who needs support. These two aspects of the Resource Center uniquely positioned us to explore topics like grief through the lens. As Mary explained in the start of the program, the Resource Center is only one of 3 incredible Eluna programs. I'm honored to work with an incredible team of program experts who manage large networks of providers like the ones represented in our conversation today, Catholic Hospice, Children's Bereavement Center in the Rio Grande Valley, and the Dougy Center. I also want to thank today's sponsor, M.ED Bank, for making today's conversation possible. If you found today's conversation helpful and would like to help us continue this work, please consider making a donation to Eluna by going to elunanetwork.org or clicking on the link in the comments or the donate button on Facebook. Please also stay connected to us via social media channels at Eluna Network, and we will continue this conversation on Instagram, and we'll post some more answers to some of the questions that came up in the chat. Thank you so much to everyone's participation today. We're so happy to be able to provide this kind of conversation to you, and we appreciate your attendance. Thank you.